Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Brian from Izzet League EDH, and there's been a bit of a controversial topic that's been cropped up within the Magic community, particularly the EDH community, even a little bit in the sort of financing portion of the Magic community as well, from buying, selling, and flipping cards and whatnot. And it's all particularly around one of the newest preview cards from Commander Legends, a card called Jeweled Lotus. Okay. Now, just to quickly go over it real quick, so some context as to why this might be kind of, creating some spur in conversation. It is a 0-drop mythic artifact that says you can tap it and sacrifice Jeweled Lotus, add 3 mana of any one color, spend this mana only to cast your commander. Okay, now hopefully for those of you out there who are new or who already are well versed in the Magic and kind of history of the game, for those of you that may not know, let me give a brief context as to why this is such a big deal. Okay, the primary reason why so many people are so worked up about this card is primarily because of the fact that it's almost literally a reprint of a reserve list card, which some of you might be familiar with as being the most expensive card in Magic's history, which is called Black Lotus. Black Lotus literally does the same exact thing as Jeweled Lotus with only one different stipulation. Black Lotus does not say that it has to only be used for your commander, okay? Whereas Jeweled Lotus does. It says spend this mana only to cast your commander, okay? Now, there's been a lot of discussion about back and forth, hate and love for this card for various different reasons. One of the biggest reasons for what's kind of spurring this debate in the first place is just the fact that, well, they're kind of skirting around the reserve list a little bit. In case you're not aware, the whole point of the reserve list is that Wizards, long time ago, around the time when Magic was first getting started, after the first few sets had come out and stuff like that, players essentially were getting upset about reprints that the company was doing. And Wizards kind of made a gut reaction response where they're like, all right, we won't reprint these cards anymore, and thus the reserved list was born. Okay, I kind of glossed over some minor details, but that's more or less what happened. Okay, and Black Lotus was among those. It was one of the first cards printed, hence why it's also so expensive. I believe it's like one, if not the only card that's literally banned in every single format in Magic. You literally cannot use it in any sanctioned play or whatnot. Even in Commander, Black Lotus itself, let me pull it up right here. Black Lotus itself is banned. Okay, so the fact that Wizards made a card called Jeweled Lotus is actually a really, really big deal. Primarily because of the fact that, well, not only is Black Lotus banned, but there's also a bunch of other cards called the Moxes that are also banned in Commander. And the Moxes are essentially kind of mini Lotuses. They tap for 1 free mana of a particular color, essentially. So it's a pretty big deal. Now, among this debate is whether or not there's kind of been sparking a discussion as to whether or not how good is even this card. Okay, which brings us kind of to today's topic for today's video. I'm gonna be going over what my thoughts are about this card. I personally, I see both sides of the argument, and I kind of agree with both sides of the argument. I don't think either side is particularly right, or I should say neither side is particularly wrong, but I don't think either side is particularly entirely correct either, if that makes sense. So I'm kind of in the middle, and I see it both ways. And long story short, which I will go in further discussion about, the power level of this card I think is entirely dependent on literally just your commander uh, and the purposes you would put for it. Okay, so let's just kind of get started before I start going on a tangent. How good is Jeweled Lotus? Okay, so just to kind of provide some comparison purposes, like we mentioned before, it is basically just kind of a reprinted version of Black Lotus, but just for Commander. And Jeweled Lotus would be legal, whereas Black Lotus is not. Okay, so one of the key distinctions being that it can only be used for Commander. Black Lotus alone is a busted card because you can use it for any card that you play, whereas Jeweled Lotus is not. So in a lot of ways, you can kind of say one-sided argument is, well, Jeweled Lotus really isn't that great of a card then, because the fact that it can practically be a dead card in the late game, but if you happen to get it early game, it is absolutely busted, which is pretty much correct, because then with that train of thought, you can pretty much argue that instead of putting Jeweled Lotus in your deck, you're much better off just having a normal card like Mana Crypt, or heck, even Soul Ring is still arguably better than a Jeweled Lotus. It's just simply because of the fact that it still provides more mana than what you're paying to play it, and on top of the fact that you can actually use Mana Crypt and Soul Ring for any card in your deck and not just your commander. Okay, so that is one side of the argument, or at least part of it anyways, which makes sense. Okay, if you pull the Jeweled Lotus late game, saying like turn 7 or something, it could potentially be a dead draw now, and essentially be no different than like a land drop, but a land drop only for your commander, which is kind of worse. Now, even with that said, there is still more context that has to be said about it that I don't think everyone's kind of taking into consideration. Okay, so just kind of some context before I further explain that. What are some actual good uses? So let's say in its best case scenario, how busted can Jeweled Lotus be? Well, obviously because of the fact that Jeweled Lotus only provides one color, that means that when you sacrifice it, 3 of mana of one color, there's pretty much one of 4 situations where you can pulling a Jeweled Lotus in your opening hand in a game of Commander is absolutely busted. Okay, the first one being that if you have any sort of commander that would really synergize with a huge burst in a turn 1 play and playing your commander. Okay, so this would be commanders, for example, such as Grand Arbiter Augustine the Fourth. Okay, he says he costs 2 generic mana, a white and a blue, so 4 mana total. He says white spells you cast cost 1 mana less to cast, and he also says blue spells you cast cost 1 mana less to cast. As well as spells your opponent's cast cost 1 more to cast. So essentially, your entire deck is 1 or 2 mana cheaper, whereas all spells your opponent's cast cost 1 mana more. As long as you have 1 land in your hand and a Jeweled Lotus in your opening hand, you can literally play Grand Arbiter Augustine IV on turn 1 and really hinder the board. Okay, this is the first example of the type of situations where Jeweled Lotus can be absolutely busted with very specific types of commanders that can really put a thorn in people's side if they manage to land right away. These are mostly going to be suited for the commanders that tend to be I guess, like, I don't know how to word it. You guys have probably experienced those situations where, like, the moment you just see the opponent's commander, you are already groaning inside because you already know what's going to happen, and your first instinct is, I cannot let this commander hit, or at least I cannot let it stay on the board for as long as possible, or if at all, if possible. As soon as it comes out, I got to kill it, get rid of it immediately, such as Grand Arbiter Augustine IV, for example. So Jeweled Lotus would work really well for those type of commanders. Another good one is just simply any mono-colored commander that is 4 mana or less will really, really take advantage of Jeweled Lotus, obviously because it produces just one color. Another example is simply being Torbrand Thane of Redfall, which is actually one of my commanders. This kind of fits in the same situation as Grand Arbor Augustine IV, just not as bad. But the fact that Torbrand is basically an aggressive red deck, getting Torbrand on turn 1, that's insane. You can simply essentially be playing 2 and 3 drops on curve the next few turns and be dishing out tons of damage before anybody can even get a creature on the field first. So that's the second situation. Just simply playing monocolored decks that are 4 mana or less. The third situation is literally playing any high costing commander, say around 6 or more, even sometimes 5, that would typically take quite a few turns before you can even attempt to play it. And this is going to be cards more along the lines of things like Keranos, God of the Storms, for example, for Izzet, going into Izzet cards as examples, where at best you're probably going to play Keranos with a Jeweled Lotus on turn 2. Okay. And then more importantly, I feel like Jeweled Lotus is going to be way better, and I'll explain in just a second why. It's going to be more so focused and best for commanders that have really high CMCs and don't normally get played until late game, or later in the game, at least mid to late game, depending on how much you're ramped. Okay, so this is going to be commanders such as the Locust God, for example. He's at 6 mana. So with Jeweled Lotus, assuming you played no other rocks aside from Jeweled Lotus, and you just play lands every turn, the earliest you can bring out the Locust God is turn 3. Okay, which is still really early. Same thing goes for other Izzet commanders like Brutaclad, Telcor, Engineer. Another one being, which is also kind of the figurehead of the channel and one of my personal decks, and the first deck I ever made for EDH, Niv Mizzet the Firemind. Okay. Quite literally, with these six costing commanders, Jeweled Lotus helps make those 6 cost into 3 drops, at least in the early turns. Now, in the worst case scenario, like I mentioned before, let's say you pull the Jeweled Lotus, let's say you pulled the Jeweled Lotus late game, and let's say you pulled it late game. In most middle decks where the commander is kind of like, a decent casting cost, is not really that expensive to play, Jeweled Lotus is more likely to have more use more often, so other words, be more consistent for commanders that cost higher, simply because of the fact that of commander tax, essentially. Okay, because commander tax is a thing, Jeweled Lotus can still help kind of mitigate the commander tax, and because commander tax tends to hurt commanders that there are more on the higher end, so around the 6 mark or more, Jeweled Lotus really actually becomes really important for those type of decks later on. And it's kind of almost the entire reason why cards like Command Beacon are such a big deal. Simply because Command Beacon helps mitigate that command tax for many commanders. Which, again, for the exact same reason, is best suited for higher costing commanders, because the moment that your commander dies once, paying 2 more, so you essentially have to pay 8 mana for like a Niv Mizzet the Firemind, for example, to play it a second time. That is already like a huge blow to your deck. Chances are for Niv Mizzet the Fireman, for example, he's more or less your primary win condition. Maybe you might have 1 or 2 alternate win conditions in your deck, but for the most part, he's your primary win condition. And you really need him to stick around in order to win the game. So in decks like Niv Mizzet the Firemind, Jeweled Lotus is actually really good for the same exact purposes that you would want like a Mana Crypt or a Soul Ring in your deck, simply because of the fact that it helps you ramp quickly, so that way in the off chance, so not only can you play the high drop commander sooner, But on the off chance that he dies and goes back to command zone, you can still bring him out pretty reasonably within the game a second time, maybe even a third time. So that's kind of the biggest aspect. So those are kind of the two sides of the argument. Well, actually, I don't think I completely explained the other sides. So that is one thing in terms of how good I think it is. Now, whether or not there's another aspect that I guess is worth discussing about Jeweled Lotus, which is the fact of Wizards essentially introducing power creep into Commander. Okay, now power creep has kind of already been a thing that has been kind of seeping into Commander just as much as it's been kind of seeping into, and many would argue, just destroyed Standard. Another format for Magic for any new players out there. Okay. I would argue that the power creep for these last few years, pretty much starting from the Kaladesh block, has pretty much destroyed Standard, has kind of more or less not touched Commander too much. It's touched it enough where I've definitely started noticing the differences as of late, particularly in how fast games are. I was discussing it with my friend Eli a few days ago, but for those of you that might have been playing in the last few years and such, you may have noticed that at least like easily 5 years ago or something, Commander games easily could last to like turn 10, or maybe like 12, depending on how the games went. Pretty easily, to the point where you can easily in your games or in your decks kind of not really have a very optimized deck. You can have some jank cards in your deck and still do fairly well. For fun, you could play all those really high costing mana cards, kind of like a 10-drop Omniscience on curve with no ramp at all whatsoever, just playing a land every turn and literally playing Omniscience on turn 10. You could literally do that like maybe 5-6 years ago or something. But these days, Commander games feel like they tend to end more on turn 7, turn 8 now these days. So if you can't really afford to play the big drops nearly as much, which again kind of goes back into what I was saying before about really helping Jeweled Lotus, really helping the higher costing commanders, such as Niv-Mizzet, the Firemind. Okay. If a game typically ends on turns 7 or 8, and Niv-Mizzet is a 6-drop, so on curve without any ramp, you'd be playing him on turn 6. That's pretty much towards the end of the game. By the time you bring him out, you should be getting ready to win the game or kill people, take people out of the game. Or otherwise, you're probably going to lose. Or if he gets removed on the spot as soon as you bring him out, you're probably going to lose, just because now it takes 2 more turns to just play him again, let alone play anything else to win with him if it's not already set up on your board. So on one aspect, I'm actually really, really glad for Jeweled Lotus coming into the format, because it really helps out the higher costing commanders that kind of fell from grace just simply because of how sped up the format has become these last few years. But obviously on the other end too, it also is a little concerning because it's just blatant power creep seeping into Commander now. Before Commander Legends came out, or at least was spoiled, you could feel it kind of slowly seeping into Commander. But now with Commander Legends coming out with like a ton of these busted new cards, on top of Jeweled Lotus obviously kind of being basically a flagship card now, chase card, it's blatantly obvious now that Commander is now kind of the next target for power creep within the format, which is concerning. So on one hand, I'm actually really excited because it makes it so that my original Commander, for instance, is actually more playable now. I can actually play my Commander more often, which it feels great. But on the other hand, it also means that it's kind of a forecast of what is to come in these next few years, which is kind of rubbing people the wrong way. So With that being said, I would love to hear what your guys' thoughts are about it, about Jeweled Lotus in the comment section down below. Do you think it's a good thing for Magic? Do you think it's not a good thing for Magic? Are you looking to put it in your types of decks? Because I know if I happen to pull it, I pre-ordered 2 boxes worth of Commander Legends before they even really started spoiling stuff. As soon as I saw day 1 spoilers, I already knew, like, yep, I have a good feeling about the set. I should lock in my prices now before the boxes EV start going up. So that's what I locked in my process my boxes real quick for those reasons. So I'll probably be doing an unboxing video when those arrive in the mail sometime next month. But go ahead and let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. It's the best way to know when I upload more videos such as this one. But other than that, this is Brian from Izzet League EDH, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace, guys.